Hi there. Welcome to our first ever Valentine's Day episode. I figured if I already have a favorite love letter, I might as well share it with you. So prepare yourself for some of the most romantic words ever committed to paper. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host, Jules, and yes, I'm going to share my favorite ever love letter with you. I might need to preface this with the fact that I'm not a major romance reader. I'm not necessarily the most romantic-minded of people, but nonetheless, there are a couple of books that just really hit the spot for me, and Persuasion by Jane Austen is one of those. Of course, we're going back to the classics, to the woman who did it all, Jane Austen. The letter I'm going to share with you is the letter written by Frederick Wentworth to Anne Elliot in the novel Persuasion. What I'm going to do first is give you a very brief summary of what happens in the novel up until the point where the letter comes. Then I will read this letter to you, and then we'll have a mini discussion about it. So, Persuasion by Jane Austen. It is actually, which is hard to admit, but I think it might actually be my favorite Jane Austen novel, even though I'm a very devout Pride and Prejudice lover as well. Persuasion was the last novel Jane Austen completed, and it was published in 1817, along with another delightful book of hers, Northanger Abbey. But it was published posthumously, so she'd already died 6 months previously before it came out. In brief, Persuasion is about Anne Elliot, who is 27 years old, which if you've watched the Pride and Prejudice film with Keira Knightley and you connect it to Charlotte's monologue about being 27 years old and already a burden, then you can kind of imagine what it means for Anne Elliot to be 27 and unmarried. She's part, as her name suggests, of the Elliot family, who have a family estate called Kellynch Hall. Her father, Sir Walter Elliot, is quite obsessed with their family status. He considers himself very important, and he thinks it's quite bad that his second daughter, Anne, is a bit dowdy and old. He prefers Elizabeth, her older sister, even though Elizabeth is also still unmarried. So there are some issues there. Anyway, by the time we hit the beginning of the novel, we already have some tragedy which took place. 7 years before the novel starts, Anne Elliot was head over heels in love with Frederick Wentworth, and he was just a sailor at the time, but the two loved each other. But everyone in her family, especially her father, but also importantly Lady Russell, a good friend of her mother's, who has already passed, were very much against the match, and they persuaded Anne to break off her engagement with Frederick. They were just like 19 years old, they were still quite young, but it broke both of their hearts, and Frederick went off to sea, and now he's actually quite distinguished. He's an officer, he's collected quite a lot of wealth by being in the Navy, and, well, he's still unmarried, and so is Anne, because she's never quite found a love or a connection to match up with it. So at the beginning of the novel, we're already dealing with a broken-hearted protagonist. She's kind of accepted that her family doesn't respect her, doesn't value her, that they kind of just consider her to be, well, also there. Sir Walter Elliot, along with being very pretentious about his family status, is also a bit of a spendthrift. He loves spending money on things which make him look good. So the Elliot family is in financial distress, and so they have to leave Kellynch Hall and rent it out and settle in Bath. Anne hates Bath. She doesn't like being in kind of polite society. She thinks it's all a bit too much for her. She'd much rather stay with her younger sister, Mary, who married Charles Musgrove. So they managed to actually find a tenant for Kellynch Hall, which is excellent, but it turns out to be Admiral Croft and his wife Sophia. Guess who Sophia is? She's Frederick's sister. And so there is a very high chance that Frederick will come to visit Kellynch Hall. So Anne is a bit like, oh my god, I'm not ready for this. I don't want to face him again. What if he's mad? What if he's not? What if he's changed? What if he notices how much I've changed? And there's already tension there. So Frederick does come to visit while Anne is staying with her sister Mary and the Musgroves. Now, the Musgroves are a delightful family, even if they're a bit all over the place. And of course, they invite Captain Wentworth to come and stay with them. Frederick Wentworth comes to visit. The first few times that Anne and Frederick see each other again, it's incredibly awkward. And Wentworth is dealing with a broken heart. He's still a little bit bitter about the fact that Anne actually broke off their engagement. He's like, well, she considered herself too good for me. And he's a bit rude in the sense that he's like, well, now that she's 27, she doesn't look as happy and healthy as she did when we knew each other 7 years ago. So he's a bit dismissive, and it does hurt Anne's feelings. And on top of that, Captain Wentworth starts flirting with the two young Musgrove girls. They've just come out of school, and they're all preppy, and they're all excited about the Navy and about this handsome captain, and Anne is just watching all of this going, yeah, I'm no longer that young and that excitable, and well, I guess I have to accept that there is no way Frederick Wentworth is going to forgive me. At a certain point, this entire group of young adults decides to go on a visit to Lyme. And that is a coastal town where Captain Wentworth actually has some friends. So they're going to visit those friends, take in the sea air, and Anne is convinced to come along, even though she's kind of been trying to keep her distance. This visit to Lyme is actually amazing. Anne feels invigorated by the fresh air, and Wentworth has a friend, Captain Benwick, who's currently kind of mourning the death of his fiancée, but him and Anne have very interesting conversations about literature and about women, and she kind of helps him through some of his grief. Tragedy also strikes there because one of the Musgrove sisters, Louisa, falls and sustains a very serious concussion. And that is a big deal in that time. They have no idea really what's going on with her. And in that moment, Anne, who, well, like I said, she's a bit of a wallflower because she's been pushed aside by her family. But this is a moment where crisis strikes and she immediately jumps in and she's like, okay, support her neck, get a doctor, do this, do that, make sure everything's good. And kind of Frederick kind of recognizes this, well, this Anne that he used to know who had a character and spirit, and he's really impressed by her. They manage to kind of settle Louisa up, and, you know, she's going to survive, but they're not quite sure what's happening with her. But she stays in Lyme. Anne, meanwhile, has to go join her father and sister in Bath. Another thing that happens, though, just before she leaves Lyme is that she and the others, including her younger sister Mary, see a mysterious man who seems to be looking at Anne like, oh, you're looking good. Who are you? And it turns out to be their cousin, Mr. Elliot, who kind of is a bit of a black sheep in the family. He rejected Sir Walter Elliot's kind of overtures of friendship and connection, but he is the heir to Kellynch Hall and to the title because women aren't allowed to inherit in these times. So they don't realize this initially, but then as they go away, they realize, oh, that was Mr. Elliot. Interesting. We haven't seen him in years. Anne gets to Bath. Lady Russell's also there. Her father and her sister are there. And, well, Anne has kind of built up a little bit of confidence and a little bit of character. She felt a lot better after spending some time away. And now that she gets to Bath, well, she kind of comes there with a bit of a new attitude, I would say. It turns out their cousin, Mr. Elliot, is also in Bath, and everyone thinks he's going to marry Elizabeth, the oldest sister, so that the family fortunes kind of can be connected and restored, etc. But Mr. Elliot actually seems more interested in Anne, and he keeps mentioning how interesting it would be and how great it would be if she would never have to change her name, etc. And Anna's like, technically, Mr. Elliot is a nice man, I think, from what I know, but I'm not really connecting with him on any serious level. So that kind of goes back and forth. And Anne is kind of in that moment where she'll have to decide, like, am I going to play into these hints that Mr. Elliot is giving me? And her family friend, Lady Russell, who dissuaded her from marrying Captain Wentworth back in the day is like, yes, it would be amazing if you could become the Mrs. Elliot of Kellynch Hall. Your mother would have been so proud of you. And Anne is like, I don't know. But at this point, she receives news that Louisa is engaged. And she's like, oh shit, that means Captain Wentworth has decided to propose to her, because Louisa was the one he was mostly flirting with, right? But then Admiral Croft and his wife arrive in Bath, and they actually tell her that no, Louisa got engaged to Captain Benwick, the kind of heartbroken friend of Wentworth's. And she's like, okay, well, interesting. Then all kinds of people start arriving in Bath, and we're leading up towards this kind of concluding kind of high point of romance, right? And Wentworth arrives, and he can see how Mr. Elliot is courting Anne, and it makes him a bit jealous. And they kind of reconnect. And at the same time, Anne also reconnects with a school friend of hers, Mrs. Smith, who's now a widow, and she's ill, so she kind of lives quite a solitary life, and Anne goes to visit her, and she finds out that Mrs. Smith's husband was good friends with Mr. Elliot, and that Mr. Elliot is actually a calculating piece of bleep. He's not a nice man whatsoever. And although he is genuinely interested in Anne, he is mostly interested in getting the title, getting Kellynch Hall, etc. So he doesn't really care about all the things that Anne cares about. So that kind of gives her the final idea of like, okay, so Mr. Elliot is definitely not an option. I knew something was wrong. My gut instinct was telling me this wasn't right. So that's a no. But then it turns out that the Musgroves, like I said, everyone gets to Bath. So the Musgroves also come to Bath because they need to get wedding clothes. And and everyone is kind of gathering, and then they're all in this one room in an inn, I believe, and everyone is chatting, and they're like, we should go do this, we should go do that. Do we have tickets for the opera or for the ballet? Well, a lot of stuff is going on, and Wentworth has just overheard a conversation between Anne and one of his other friends in which they discuss that, well, Benwick has gotten over the grief of his lost fiancée quite quickly, hasn't he? And, well, Anne says some quite beautiful words about how women love longest and how they are very faithful to those that they love. And this triggers something in Wentworth. So while they're all sitting there all together, well, the two can't have a private conversation. There's people around. So Wentworth writes her a letter. That gives you enough of the plot. So now I'm going to just dive straight into this beautiful, beautiful letter. I can listen no longer in silence. I must speak to you by such means as are within my reach. You pierce my soul. I am half agony, half hope. Tell me not that I am too late, that such precious feelings are gone forever. I offer myself to you again with a heart even more your own than when you almost broke it 8 years and a half ago. Dare not say that man forgets sooner than woman, that his love has an earlier death. I have loved none but you. Unjust I may have been, weak and resentful I have been, but never inconstant. You alone have brought me to Bath. For you alone I think and plan. Have you not seen this? Can you fail to have understood my wishes? I had not waited even these 10 days could I have read your feelings, as I think you must have penetrated mine. I can hardly write. I am every instant hearing something which overpowers me. You sink your voice, but I can distinguish the tones of that voice when they would be lost on others. Too good, too excellent creature, you do us justice indeed. You do believe that there is true attachment and constancy among men. Believe it to be most fervent, most undeviating in Frederick Wentworth. I must go, uncertain of my fate, but I shall return hither, or follow your party as soon as possible. A word, a look, will be enough to decide whether I enter your father's house this evening or never. I love that letter. I don't know why it hits so hard, but it does. I think it's beautiful, and it summarizes so many of the important elements of the story and of the characterization. So basically, like I said, Wentworth, Anne, all the Musgroves, and other friends and people, they're all together in this room. So Wentworth can't actually go and talk to Anne, even though he's just overheard her talking about how long love lasts. And so he's like, okay, well, that must mean that she still loves me, right? Like, that is a secret clue just for me. She's like Taylor Swift dropping Easter eggs. So I'm going to tell her, and I'm going to do this by writing a letter. So he writes this letter that I've just read to you, and then he kind of just casually shoves it over to her, and then he has to leave because he has to go, I don't know, look at a horse, men's things in Bath. And Anne reads this, and so many things just kind of click for her. And of course, then she meets Captain Wentworth again, and she does give him a look, she does give him a word, and the two are reunited, and it's beautiful. But why is this letter so beautiful to me? Well, like I said, I think this letter does a lot for the character development, and it also shows why Jane Austen's heroes are so excellent. The first thing that I like is just the dramatic nature of "you pierce my soul, I'm half agony, half hope." It's beautifully romantic. But the effort that Wentworth puts into his letter, the way in which he addresses the fact that he was heartbroken, but that he is now more than ever hers, it kind of addresses the fact that, well, when they first met at age 19, they were young, and neither of them had money. They might not have had a happy marriage, a happy relationship. They were perhaps too young, and they didn't know themselves well enough yet to truly connect to each other on the level that they kind of can now, where they're at the end of their 20s, you know, they are more settled in their character, they have more world experience, Wentworth has money, which helps. They can actually set out on a proper married life, more established as people. And I find that fascinating. In so much romance, you have kind of these young characters who completely dedicate themselves to each other before they've even seen the world. And you just wonder what's going to happen after the happy ever after, because, well, these people are still going to have to find work, find jobs, pay taxes, figure out how all those things work, right? And now these two people, Anne and Frederick, they know each other's families, which is important. Frederick knows that the Elliots suck, except for Anne. And she knows his sister, and she knows more about his life. She has a much more stable personality. This idea of that she could be dissuaded out of something, it's not quite true anymore. And actually, after Anne has read the letter, they do have a short conversation where he's like, I'm still a little bit hurt that you allowed Lady Russell to dissuade you from marrying me. And Anne kind of stands up for herself, even towards Frederick. And she's like, no, I think it was right for us to wait. It shouldn't have happened the way it happened, but it wasn't bad that we didn't get married straight away. And you get this real idea of like, okay, Anne has really grown into herself, and Frederick can now respect her on a new level as well. So that's lovely. I love that the letter addresses that as well. Then there's also the part where Frederick manages to be a bit self-reflective and a bit self-critical when he says that unjust I may have been, weak, resentful I have been, but never inconstant, because he did spend at least a good third of the novel flirting with two other women in front of Anne. So he was being resentful, and he was being spiteful, and good for him for saying that was weak as well. I would say it's also a bit unjust, because he did say some not so nice things about Anne, but he becomes aware of that, right? He realizes that the things I did were things I did out of anger and out of hurt, and you didn't deserve that, and I do apologize for that. And he does also mention the fact that his love for her has always been there, that he may have wavered and been weak, but not inconstant in his love. So that is beautiful. And he's starting to plan ahead for her, and I love the fact that he's like, can you see what I'm trying to do? And Anne has already kind of picked up on little hints of his, of like, okay, the fact that he's behaving like this, I think he is actually still interested in me. So Anne is actually quite capable of reading him, but he is not quite as perceptive of her feelings yet. But then, on the other hand, what I think is beautiful towards the end is that even if he has been a bit unjust to her, he has always noticed her. And there are instances quite early on when they're still with the Musgroves, where they're going on this very long walk, and Anne is not quite as physically strong as some of the others. So at a certain point, she's just very tired, and he makes sure that she gets a carriage ride back to the house. So he has always kind of noticed her, even if he tried to push that away. And so that line of, "You sink your voice, but I can distinguish the tones of that voice when they would be lost on others," it shows that, well, he's once again kind of fully taking ownership of the fact that he sees her, and that he is aware that others don't, that he's aware that her family mistreats her in certain ways, but that he wants to listen to her, hear her opinions, etc. And I think that's very important in a relationship. Communication is key, right? And it's also nice that then in that scene we get where they discuss kind of their first engagement, that he does actually also listen to her, and that he admits that maybe he's been a bit overruled by his own personal hurt. And she also acknowledges that. She acknowledges that, he was hurt by it. So there's a strong communication which is set up here as well. And then, of course, the fact that they're going to communicate by a word and by a look, and that's exactly what they do, and that's just very nice and romantic. So yeah, I think it's a beautiful letter which comes at an excellent moment in the story, and just this idea that you have these two characters sitting in the same room, surrounded by others, and they're so attuned to each other. They can hear, they pick up each other's voices from across the room. They want to communicate with each other so badly, but there are so many maybe social restrictions in place, but also personal feelings that kind of keep them from actually speaking to each other. And that someone then breaks through that in the only way possible by writing a letter to them and just laying himself completely bare, making himself incredibly vulnerable, and that Anne can then respond to that and reciprocate that. I think that's beautiful. And again, I think it's just excellent to have two romantic leads who are not 18, especially as I've now myself older than Anne. I'm like, that's excellent. People need to find love throughout their lives. And coming back to this idea of Jane Austen's heroes. So I think most people are, of course, familiar with Mr. Darcy and the fact that, he's such a paragon of male excellence, etc. And, well, not really. When I first read the book, I was 14 and easily impressed, and I was like, oh my god, this man is broody and silent and taciturn. Ooh. But then, actually, as you grow up a little bit, and as you gain more experience with people, you kind of start to realize what actually makes her characters, not just her male characters, but also her female characters, and the way in which they come to love, so excellent. And that is because falling in love and opening themselves up to that partner for almost all of her characters is also a way of getting to know themselves better. In the case of Persuasion, Anne initially fell in love, and it was a young love, and it was passionate, and it was fast, and it was intoxicating. And now that she's a bit older, she can fall in love kind of more solidly, if that makes sense. And she can reflect upon her own actions, the way in which others influenced her, the way she might have influence over others. And she can kind of deal with all of those aspects of herself as her and Frederick Wentworth reconnect. And similarly, Frederick has to really reassess how he's been thinking about himself and about Anne for the past 8.5 years, and that he may have been unjust, and that he needs to address that and needs to apologize for that. And it's especially that people recognize their own flaws and communicate these with their partners and make an independent attempt to improve, to get better. I think that is an element which plays very strongly in Persuasion, but also very much in Pride and Prejudice. Both Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy are quite flawed people, and I think that's why it's easy to love them, because Elizabeth is, I adore Lizzie. She is brash, she's intelligent, sometimes she'll just say exactly what she thinks, she'll say it as she sees it, and that makes it easy to love her. But then, as the novel progresses, she realizes that, well, the way she sees things is subjective, her perspective is flawed. she is the prejudice part of the title, right? She makes snap judgments and then she'll stick to those. And one of the things she has to learn is to undo some of her own kind of unconscious biases almost. Elizabeth does also have to learn to take a step back, actually reflect upon the things she hears and learns, and to maybe also keep certain things to herself rather than spread her opinions around, right? And these are things she has to learn for herself. These are things she becomes aware of as her opinion of Mr. Darcy changes, as she falls in love. That's work that she does. And Mr. Darcy starts the novel as an incredibly socially awkward man that is legitimately like, he is incredibly awkward at parties. He'd prefer to just stand in the corner and look, which makes him a bit creepy maybe, but also very understandable. We all feel a little bit intimidated in big crowds. He therefore starts the novel in this quite awkward position, but because of his status in society, he has a lot of pride. And he does think he deserves to be treated a certain way, etc. And he doesn't even consider that the way he handles himself is hurtful to others. And that is something he comes to realize. Like, initially, I think his love for Elizabeth is something of an infatuation. I think she's just something he hasn't seen before. And he's like, who is this slightly insane woman with a horrible family? and she's just so brave and daring, and she says things, and she engages me in conversation, and I think it's more of an infatuation at the beginning. And then when she rejects him and she gives these reasons for why, well, the beautiful thing that makes it such a good novel is that he actually takes that to heart. Of course, he's offended and hurt that she dare reject him, because she should be happy that someone like him would propose to her. But when he takes a moment to reflect upon it, he does then actually recognize, like, yes, okay, some of the things I've done were out of pride. They weren't good, or at least I didn't explain my motivations properly, which means they had negative consequences. And so he changes that behavior without then going to Elizabeth and saying, look at all these things I've done, now you should marry me because I've cancelled out all of your objections. No. He actually falls, I think, properly in love with her and comes to realize he's not an ideal partner. He's not an ideal person. And without putting an expectation on Elizabeth, he does start changing his behavior. He becomes a better friend. He becomes, I think, a better brother as well. And because of that, when Elizabeth and Darcy reconnect, their love is more solid because it's based on more self-knowledge. They know who they are, they understand their own benefits, but they also understand their own flaws, and they have found partners with whom they can discuss this, who will give them honest feedback, and with whom they can start a more stable life, I would say, because they have had these moments of growth and self-development. Now, I've been talking about Pride and Prejudice for a while, but I think this is true for Persuasion as well, and I just think this letter by Wentworth is just one of the most beautiful things ever, because it kind of encompasses so many of those things. It has yearning, it has this, like, I've been looking at you from across the ballroom, why haven't you noticed how deeply in love I am with you? It has that. And it also has, I know your family sucks, but I'm willing to go through that with you. We'll sit together at Christmas and we'll just squeeze hands under the table. It has that. And it also has, yes, I know I've been rude and I'm sorry. That was because I was dealing with issues and it wasn't your fault and I will do better. It has that. It has so many excellent things. So yeah, maybe I am a bit of a romantic. I think I might be a skeptic romantic, where deep down I've got high hopes for love. I'm like, love is going to be all-encompassing and a good thing all around. And then I'm like, but okay, apparently first I need to have my heart broken and rudely reject someone, and only then will I learn more about myself. But for this Valentine's Day, I hope that you've enjoyed this love letter. There's a high chance I'll do an episode on Persuasion at some point, but the first Jane Austen book I want to get into with you soon is Mansfield Park, which I read as a horror novel. So that's quite different from what I've just discussed. Anyway, I'm going to leave you here. I hope you have a lovely Valentine's Day. if you celebrate. And otherwise, I'll be back in a week and a half. Bye! And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.